What would you do if you had lost everything? Your farm, your family, your name itself turned to dust in the wind. What if, with your last $3, you bought the one thing no one else in the world would even take for free? That's what one man did. He paid $3 silver for a burned-out cabin, a blackened scar on a forgotten piece of land, and in doing so, he bought the laughter and scorn of an entire town. But the truth waiting for him beneath the ash and charcoal, a secret the fire itself couldn't destroy, was a discovery that would not only make him a wealthy man, but would restore the very thing he thought he'd lost forever. Settle in and stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of Silas Croft and the inheritance of Ash. Silas Croft rode into the town of Redemption Peak on a horse as tired as he was. The horse, an old gray gelding named Bartholomew with a swayback and one cloudy eye, moved with the slow, resigned gait of a creature who had long since given up on arriving anywhere good. Silas matched him. His shoulders were slumped inside a canvas coat worn thin at the elbows, and the brim of his hat was pulled low. Not against the sun, but against the memory of faces. Dust, the fine pale dust of the high plains, coated them both, a second skin of failure. He had been gone for 10 years, and in that time, the world had taken everything from him. The farm his father had built, lost to a 3-year drought that had cracked the earth like old pottery. His wife Martha, taken by a fever that same merciless winter. He had a memory of her hands, kneading dough, the flour dusting her arms, and the memory was so sharp it was like a physical pain in his chest. He had left Redemption Peak a proud young man with a future. He returned a ghost, haunted by the past, with nothing to his name but the clothes he wore, the horse beneath him, and a handful of coins that rattled with a lonely sound in his pocket. The town hadn't changed much. The same false-fronted buildings lined the single dusty street. The same wind whistled through the gaps between the planks of the general store. But the people had changed, or maybe he had. Their faces seemed harder, their eyes quicker to judge. He saw it as he tied Bartholomew to the hitching post outside the land office. Men stopped their conversations, their gazes lingering on his worn-out rig, on the gauntness of his face. He heard the whispers begin, a low murmur that followed him up the wooden steps. Inside, the air was stale with the smell of old paper and chewing tobacco. The clerk, a young man Silas didn't recognize, looked up with bored indifference. It was then that Jedediah Thorne turned from the large map pinned to the wall. Thorne was a man who had grown larger while Silas had been shrinking. His belly strained the buttons of his waistcoat, and a thick gold chain was draped across it. He was a land speculator, a man who bought up failed homesteads and sold them for a profit, a vulture who fed on the misfortunes of others. He had bought Silas's own family land at auction. Thorne's eyes, small and shrewd, narrowed in recognition. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," he boomed, his voice filling the small office. "Silas Croft, come crawling back from whatever hole you disappeared into." Silas said nothing. He just stood there, his hands loose at his sides, absorbing the insult like a dry sponge absorbs water. He was used to it. "What brings you here, Croft?" Thorne continued, enjoying his audience of the clerk and 2 other men who had been loitering. "Looking for a handout?" Silas finally looked at the clerk. "I'm looking for a parcel," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Something small, something nobody wants." Thorne let out a great bark of laughter. "He wants something nobody wants. Well, you're in luck. There is one piece of worthless ground even I won't touch." He jabbed a thick finger at the map, at a small square on the far edge of the valley, hard against the granite teeth of the mountains. The old McLeod place, burned to the ground last spring, nothing left but a chimney stack and a field of thistles. Total loss. The clerk shuffled through some papers. Lot 17, 5 acres, delinquent on taxes. How much? Silas asked. The clerk shrugged. $3, to clear the books. Thorne laughed again, louder this time. $3 for a pile of charcoal. You'd be a fool, Croft. Even for you. Silas slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his remaining coins. He counted out 3 silver dollars and placed them on the counter. They made a small, final sound. The clerk stamped the deed. Thorne just shook his head, a look of theatrical pity on his face. Silas took the paper, folded it, and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat. He turned and walked out, the sound of Jedediah Thorne's laughter following him into the unforgiving sunlight. He had just spent his last dollar on a ruin. Was it an act of desperation, or did some deeper instinct guide Silas's hand? What secret could a pile of ash and cinders possibly hold that a man like Thorne, who could smell a dollar under a foot of rock, had missed entirely? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and if you're enjoying our story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten history. For Silas Croft, the laughter of the town was still ringing in his ears as he mounted his old horse and turned toward the mountains, toward the property that was now his, and the truth that had been waiting for him all along. The mockery didn't end at the land office. It followed him like a stray dog through the rest of the town. As he bought a small sack of flour and some salt pork at the general store, the last of his provisions, he could feel the eyes of the other customers on his back. He heard a woman whisper to her friend, "That's him, the one who bought the burnout." The friend clucked her tongue. Poor soul. Lost his mind along with his farm, it seems. In the saloon, where he went only to fill his canteen with water, the talk was louder. A group of ranch hands stood at the bar, and one of them called out, "Hey, Croft! Hear you're a landowner now. Planning on farming charcoal?" The others guffawed. Jedediah Thorne was there, of course, holding court. He raised his whiskey glass in a mock toast. To Silas Croft, the king of ash and ruin. Silas simply filled his canteen, tightened the cap, and walked out, the door swinging shut on their jeers. He had learned long ago that answering fools only encouraged them. Silence was his only shield. As he was preparing to leave town, leading Bartholomew toward the road that wound up into the foothills, a figure stepped out from the deep shade of the blacksmith's forge. It was an old woman, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles. She was known in town only as Ilara, a woman of the Ute people who had refused to leave when her tribe was moved to a reservation decades ago. She lived on her own, spoke little, and was regarded by the townsfolk with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. She held a small, tightly woven basket in her hands. She looked at Silas, her dark eyes seeming to see right through his worn coat and into the hollow space his grief had carved inside him. She didn't offer sympathy. She simply held out the basket. Inside were 3 hardy, wrinkled apples and a piece of dried venison. Silas hesitated, but she pushed it into his hands. "The ground remembers what the fire forgets," she said, her voice low and raspy, like stones rubbing together. That was all. She turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shadows as quietly as she had appeared. Silas stood there, holding the basket, the weight of her words settling on him. He didn't understand them, but he felt their significance. a small, solid thing in a world that had become thin and brittle. He tied the basket to his saddle, the simple gift a stark contrast to the scorn he'd received from everyone else. He was almost out of town when Thorn rode up beside him on a fine black stallion that pranced and tossed its head. The horse was everything Bartholomew was not: strong, proud, and expensive. "Last chance, Croft?" Thorn said, his voice slick with false concern. "I feel bad for you. That land's cursed. Old Man McLeod was a strange one. Died in the fire, they say. Probably for the best. I'll give you $4 for the deed. You'll make $1 profit." He winked, as if they were sharing a clever joke. Silas looked from Thorn's fleshy, satisfied face to the distant dark smudge against the mountains that was his new property. He thought of the laughter. He thought of the old woman's words. He pulled the brim of his hat down a little further. "No, thank you, Mr. Thorn," he said, his voice even. "I think I'll keep it." Thorn's face hardened, the mask of pity dropping away. "Have it your way, you stubborn fool," he sneered. "Starve on it for all I care. You'll come begging before the first snow." He spurred his horse, showering Silas and Bartholomew in a cloud of dust, and galloped back toward the town. Silas waited for the dust to settle, then gently clicked his tongue. Bartholomew took a slow step forward, then another, leaving the town of Redemption Peak and its judgments behind them. Ahead lay only the silence of the high country and a pile of blackened timbers that he now called home. The journey to Lot 17 was a slow climb out of the valley's basin. The road, little more than a pair of wagon ruts, grew fainter with every mile, surrendering first to hardy grasses and then to the encroaching stones of the high country. The air grew thinner, cleaner, scented with pine and the cool, earthy smell of the mountains. For the first time in a long time, Silas felt a loosening in his chest. Here, there were no whispers, no pitying glances. There was only the vast, indifferent sky, the patient strength of the granite peaks, and the steady, rhythmic plodding of Bartholomew's hooves. The horse seemed to feel it too. His ears pricked forward, his step a little less weary. They were leaving the world of men and entering the world of the land, and for both of them, it felt like a kind of homecoming. The sun was beginning its long, slow descent toward the western ridge when he saw it. From a distance, it was just what Thorn had described, a dark scar on a gentle slope, marked by the skeletal finger of a stone chimney. As he drew closer, the full scope of the desolation became clear. The cabin had been consumed by a fire of incredible intensity. What timbers remained were charred to the consistency of coal, fragile and black. The roof was gone entirely, leaving a jagged rectangle of foundation open to the sky. Patches of what had once been the walls lay in heaps of blackened debris. Weeds and thistles, nature's opportunists, were already pushing their way up through the ash. A cold wind funneled down from the peaks, moaning as it passed through the hollowed-out ruin. It sounded like a lament. Any hope Silas might have harbored, a tiny, foolish ember, seemed to die in that moment. The place looked worse than worthless. It looked hopeless. He dismounted, his joints aching from the long ride. Bartholomew nudged his shoulder with his nose, a silent question. "Well, old friend," Silas murmured, stroking the horse's dusty neck. "This is it." He didn't approach the ruin directly. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the 5 acres, his boots crunching on dry soil and loose rock. The land was sloped, rocky, and covered in sagebrush and tough mountain grasses. It was poor land for farming, poor land for grazing. He could see why no one wanted it. The only redeeming feature was a small, clear creek that trickled down from the higher elevations, carving a shallow course along the property's northern edge. At least there was water. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, he chose a spot for his camp, a small, level patch of ground under the shelter of a cluster of old pine trees, 100 yards or so from the cabin's remains. He unsaddled Bartholomew, rubbed him down, and let him graze by the creek. He built a small fire, its cheerful crackle a small defiance against the encroaching chill and the sorrowful ruin that watched him from the hillside. He ate one of Ilara's apples and a piece of the venison. The apple was crisp and tart, the meat salty and rich. It was the best meal he'd had in months. He didn't unroll his bedroll right away. He sat by the fire, nursing a tin cup of hot water, and just watched the cabin. The rising moon cast it in silver, skeletal light, making the shadows within it seem deep and mysterious. He listened. He heard the wind sighing through the charred timbers, the distant call of a night bird, the gentle murmur of the creek. He was listening to the land, to the place itself, letting its silence wash over him, cleansing him of the town's noise. That night, he slept near the ruin, a man with nothing, camped beside a structure that was less than nothing. And yet, for the first time since Martha's passing, he did not dream of what he had lost. He dreamed of stone and water and the patient turning of the seasons. For 3 days, Silas did nothing but exist on the land. He moved his small camp closer to the creek, repaired a section of old fence to create a small paddock for Bartholomew, and spent his hours walking the property, his eyes on the ground. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was simply learning the contours of his new world, the way the light fell at dawn, the types of rocks that littered the soil, the paths the deer used to come down to the water. He was letting the place speak to him in its own language. The burned-out cabin remained a silent, brooding presence at the center of it all. He had walked around it, peered into its blackened interior, but had not yet stepped inside. It felt like a violation, a place of death that demanded a certain respect. He was content to observe it from a distance. On the 4th morning, he decided it was time. The sun was bright, the air crisp and clean. It felt like a day for beginnings. He walked up the gentle slope to the ruin, his boots leaving dark prints in the dew-dampened ash. He stopped at the threshold, where a door had once been. The fire had been so hot, it had melted the glass from the single window, leaving weeping, hardened drips on the charred sill. He stepped over the stone lintel and into the ruin. Inside, the smell of old smoke was still thick and cloying. The floor was a treacherous landscape of fallen beams, broken crockery, and a thick layer of ash and dirt. It was a scene of utter destruction. He moved slowly, carefully, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage. There was a rusted iron stove toppled on its side. A bed frame, its metal twisted into a grotesque shape by the heat. The remnants of a table and a single chair. It was a Spartan existence, even before the fire. Old Man MacLeod, whoever he had not been a man of many possessions. Silas made his way to the one standing structure, the chimney and fireplace. It was well built, made of large, expertly fitted river stones. It had been the heart of the cabin, and it was the only part that had truly survived. He ran a calloused hand over the cool, rough surface of the stones. They were solid, dependable. He looked at the hearth, choked with debris, and that's when he saw it. A small detail, something that didn't quite fit. Most of the stones in the chimney were the common, rounded gray and brown stones found all over the valley and in the creek bed. But one of the foundation stones, at the very base of the structure on the right side, was different. It was not a river stone. It was a large rectangular block of granite, a soft rose color, with sides that were unnaturally flat and smooth. It had been dressed, shaped by a skilled hand. More than that, Silas, who had grown up working the land, knew the rocks of this region. He had never seen that type of pinkish granite anywhere in Redemption Valley. It came from somewhere else. It was out of place. He knelt, brushing the ash away from its surface. It was perfectly set, flush with the other stones. But it was an anomaly. An import. Why would a poor homesteader, building a simple cabin, go to the trouble and expense of hauling a single, massive, dressed block of granite from miles away to use as a foundation stone for his chimney? It made no sense. He frowned, a question taking root in his mind. He didn't have an answer. He stood up, his eyes scanning the ruin again, but now with a new intensity. He was no longer just looking at a scene of destruction. He was looking for a reason. The strange stone sat there, silent and solid, a quiet contradiction in a story he was only just beginning to read. The question of the rose-colored granite stone became a quiet obsession. It was a loose thread, and Silas couldn't help but pull at it. He decided the only way to understand the cabin was to dismantle it, piece by painful piece. He began the slow, arduous work of clearing the debris. It was back-breaking labor. He used his bare hands and a rusty shovel he'd found half buried near the creek. He hauled the charred timbers out of the foundation, stacking them in a pile to be used for firewood. He sifted through the ash, collecting bent nails and scraps of metal, things that could be straightened and reused. Every muscle in his body ached by the end of the day, but the work felt good. It was purposeful. With each beam he moved, with each shovelful of ash he cleared, he felt as if he were clearing away not just the ruin of a cabin, but the ruin of his own past. Bartholomew would stand nearby in his small paddock, watching him with his one good eye, occasionally letting out a low nicker as if in encouragement. In the evenings, Silas would talk to the old horse, his voice the only human sound for miles. He was a careful builder, this MacLeod, he'd murmur, rubbing the horse's neck. Everything set just so, even the parts that burned. As he worked his way down to the floor level, the clues began to compound. Near the front door, buried under a layer of soot and hardened mud, he found the remains of a lock. It wasn't the simple latch or bolt one would expect on a frontier cabin. It was a heavy-duty iron tumbler lock, the kind used for bank vaults or jail cells. The mechanism was fused by the heat, but its size and complexity were unmistakable. Why would a man living alone in the wilderness need a lock of such formidable strength? A few days later, as he was clearing the floor joists in the corner farthest from the fireplace, he made another strange discovery. While most of the thick log joists were spaced about 2 feet apart, the standard for construction, the ones in this specific 10 by 10 foot section, were set barely 6 inches from one another. They were reinforced with heavy iron straps bolted into the main foundation stones. This corner of the floor had been built to support an immense weight, far more than any piece of furniture would require. It was the kind of bracing you'd use for a blacksmith's anvil or a heavy piece of machinery, neither of which was present in the ruin. His hands, calloused and sore, were learning the story. His mind was still trying to catch up. He began to form a picture of Old Man MacLeod. He was not just a homesteader. He was a man with secrets, a man who built things to last, and a man who was protecting something. The heavy lock, the reinforced floor, the out-of-place granite stone, they were all pieces of a puzzle. The edges were still murky, but the shape was beginning to form. This cabin wasn't just a place to live. It was a place to work. It was a fortress. The laughter of Jedediah Thorne and the townspeople seemed very far away now. They had laughed at a pile of ash. They had no idea about the stones beneath. Silas kept working, his pace steady and determined, driven now by a deep and compelling curiosity. The fire had taken the house, but it hadn't taken its secrets. They were waiting in the earth, and Silas was getting closer with every handful of dirt he moved. The reinforced corner of the cabin became the focus of his efforts. The earth there was packed hard, almost like stone itself. Days of sun and seasons of rain had turned it into a stubborn, unyielding surface. He worked at it with the shovel, the blade scraping and ringing against the compacted dirt. It was slow going. He was nearly a foot down when it happened. The tip of his shovel struck something that wasn't earth or stone. It made a dull, metallic clank. Not the high ring of hitting a rock, but a flat, solid thud. He stopped, his heart giving a sudden, hard beat. He knelt and dug carefully with his hands, scooping away the loose dirt. His fingers brushed against a cold, flat surface. He kept digging, his excitement mounting, until he had uncovered the corner of a large, flat iron plate, about 2 inches thick and pitted with rust. Set into the plate was a heavy iron ring, flush with the surface. It was a handle, a trap door. It took him the better part of an hour to clear the entire plate. It was a perfect 4-foot square of solid iron, immensely heavy. He looped a length of rope through the ring, braced his feet against the foundation, and pulled. Nothing. The plate didn't budge. It was sealed tight by dirt and time. He brought Bartholomew over, hitching the rope to the horse's saddle horn. "Easy, old friend," he said softly, taking the bridle. "Just a little." He urged the horse forward. Bartholomew leaned into the weight, his old muscles straining. There was a groaning, scraping sound as the seal of dirt broke, and then with a sudden lurch, the iron plate lifted and scraped aside, revealing a dark, square opening in the earth. A wave of cold, musty air rose from the hole, a smell of deep earth, of stillness, and of something else. A faint, clean, mineral scent. Like a freshly struck rock, he tethered Bartholomew and lit his lantern. The flickering yellow light cut through the darkness, but only just. He held it over the opening. A set of steep, narrow stone steps led down into the black. Taking a deep breath, Silas lowered himself onto the first step. The air was colder here, the silence profound. He descended slowly, the lantern light throwing his shadow, huge and distorted, against the earthen walls. The steps ended on a floor of smooth, packed clay. It was a small, man-made cellar, no bigger than the reinforced section of floor above it. The walls were lined with shelves, and on them, Silas's light revealed an astonishing sight. This was no root cellar. On one shelf sat a collection of tools, but not farm tools. These were fine, precise instruments, rock hammers with slender, pointed heads, delicate chisels, brass calipers, and a set of nested metal sieves. On another shelf were glass jars filled with labeled rock and mineral samples, their crystalline structures glittering in the lantern light. And on a third, carefully rolled and tied with leather thongs, were dozens of oilcloth maps. This was the workshop of a geologist, a prospector, a scientist. In the center of the room was a small, sturdy table. On it sat a heavy, leather-bound ledger, its cover protected from the damp by a sheet of oiled canvas. Its pages were filled with a neat, precise hand. Silas opened it, his hands trembling slightly. The first page was dated 15 years prior. My name is Alistair MacLeod, it began. I am a mineralogist. I have left the world of academies and arguments to seek the truth in the earth itself. And here, in this forgotten valley, I have found it. As Silas read, the story of the cabin, of the man who built it, unfurled. MacLeod hadn't found gold or silver. He had found something far rarer. The journal described, in meticulous detail, his discovery of a unique, concentrated vein of tellurium, a brittle, silvery white element incredibly scarce and, as MacLeod correctly theorized, essential for new types of electrical conduction and metallurgy. The maps charted the vein's course through the property. The rose-colored granite stone wasn't just a foundation. It was a marker, a sample of the granite strata in which the tellurium was found. The final entries were frantic, paranoid. A rival from his academic past, a man named Thorne, Jedediah Thorne's father, had tracked him down, trying to steal his claim. MacLeod wrote of setting a fire himself, a desperate act to destroy his surface research and make the property seem worthless, hoping to protect the real secret hidden below. He had planned to escape, but the fire had raged out of control faster than he anticipated. The last entry was a single, hasty scrawl. The ground remembers. Ilara's words. Silas closed the journal, the lantern light glinting on his stunned face. He looked around the hidden cellar, at the life's work of a brilliant, secretive man. He had paid $3 for a pile of ash. He now understood he was the heir to a fortune. For a week, Silas lived in a state of quiet wonder. He spent his days clearing the rest of the cabin, his labor now imbued with a sense of purpose that was almost reverent. He was no longer just a scavenger. He was a custodian. He spent his evenings in the cellar by lantern light, poring over Alistair MacLeod's journal and maps. He learned about geology, about mineralogy, about the patient, methodical work of reading the story written in the rocks. He felt a deep kinship with the man he had never met, another quiet soul who had sought refuge and truth in the solitude of the mountains. He felt the weight of the legacy that had been passed to him, not just of the valuable mineral in the ground, but of a life dedicated to knowledge and discovery. He knew he had to proceed carefully. A discovery of this magnitude would attract vultures, men like Jedediah Thorne. He had to be smart. But before he could make a plan, the sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue for weeks, began to change. A strange, yellowish light filtered down into the valley. The wind picked up, carrying a biting chill that spoke of winter's imminent arrival. The peaks of the mountains disappeared behind a roiling wall of dark gray clouds that moved with unnatural speed. An early, violent blizzard was bearing down on them. Silas worked quickly, securing what he could. He brought Bartholomew into the shelter of the cabin's foundation walls, rigging a small lean-to with a salvaged piece of tin roofing. He carried his meager supplies down into the cellar, along with a good stock of the firewood he'd cut from the charred timbers. The first flakes of snow began to fall as dusk settled, thick and wet. Within an hour, it was a raging whiteout. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the snow fell so heavily he couldn't see 10 feet in front of him. He sat in the mouth of the cellar, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, watching the storm obliterate the world. He was safe, warm, and sheltered. The very ground that had held MacLeod's secret was now protecting him. Late that night, over the howl of the wind, he heard another sound, a desperate human cry. He grabbed his lantern and climbed the steps, pulling his coat tight against the gale. The wind tore at him, and the snow stung his face like needles. He held the lantern high, its light a tiny, fragile beacon in the maelstrom. Through the swirling snow, he saw them, A wagon, its front wheel shattered, had slid off the barely visible track about 200 yards away. A man was struggling with the horses, while a woman, holding a small child wrapped in a blanket, huddled against the side of the wagon. Without a second thought, Silas plunged into the storm. He fought his way through the deepening drifts, shouting to them, his voice snatched away by the wind. The man, whose name was Miller, looked at him with a mixture of terror and relief. His wife was in labor. They had been trying to get to the doctor in Redemption Peak when the wheel broke. They were freezing, exhausted, and terrified. Silas didn't hesitate. He helped Miller unhitch the horses and led them back toward the ruin. He guided the woman, who was leaning heavily on her husband, toward the cellar. He settled them inside, giving them his own blankets, stoking the small fire he'd built in a makeshift brazier. For the next 2 days, as the blizzard raged outside, the hidden cellar became a sanctuary. Silas shared his food, the last of Alara's venison and his own small stores. He used his knowledge of the land to melt snow for clean water. He offered what comfort he could, his quiet, steady presence a balm to their fear. On the second night, with the wind still screaming and the snow piling in drifts against the foundation walls, Mrs. Miller gave birth to a healthy baby boy. In the lantern-lit cellar, surrounded by the tools and maps of a long-dead scientist, a new life had begun. Silas Croft, the man who had lost everything, had just saved a family. He had used the legacy of the cabin not for wealth, but for life. In that moment, he knew he was no longer just the owner of this land. He was its steward. When the storm finally broke on the third morning, the world was transformed. It was covered in a thick, pristine blanket of white. The sunlight on the snow so bright it was blinding. The air was still and cold and utterly silent. The Miller family was weak, but safe. Mr. Miller looked at Silas, his eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. "We owe you our lives," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have no way to repay you." "There's nothing to repay," Silas replied simply. "You needed shelter. The mountain provided." He helped Miller fashion a crude sledge to carry his wife and new baby, and using Bartholomew and one of the Miller's own horses, he helped them begin the slow journey back toward town. As he watched them go, a tiny dark procession against the vast expanse of white, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. His discovery had been tested, and he had chosen correctly. He had chosen community over secrecy, life over wealth. The secret of the tellurium could wait. A week later, the story had made its way through Redemption Peak. The Millers, safe and sound, had told everyone of the quiet, solitary man in the burned-out cabin who had taken them in from the blizzard and saved them. They spoke of his kindness, his calm competence, and the strange, deep cellar that had served as their sanctuary. The narrative of Silas Croft, the town fool, began to crumble. People looked at him differently when he rode into town for supplies. The whispers were still there, but now they were tinged with curiosity and respect, not scorn. He ignored them, as always. He had not acted for their approval. He went to the assay office, a small shack at the edge of town run by a traveling assayer named Mr. Elias Vance, a quiet, scholarly man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. Silas laid one of McLeod's maps on the counter, along with a small, heavy rock sample from the vein. He said nothing, simply waiting for the man to look. Mr. Vance examined the rock, turning it over and over under his magnifying glass. He scraped a small piece of it, subjected it to a few simple chemical tests. His eyebrows rose higher and higher. He then unrolled the map and studied it. his finger tracing MacLeod's precise lines. Finally, he looked up at Silas, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. "My good man," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you have any idea what you found?" "I have some idea," Silas said quietly. "This map," Vance continued, tapping the oilcloth, "and this sample. This is the most significant tellurium deposit I have ever seen, potentially one of the richest on the continent. The purity is extraordinary." Just then, the door to the office opened, and Jedediah Thorne strode in. He saw Silas, saw the map and the sample on the counter, and his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What's this, Croft?" he demanded. "Playing with rocks now?" "Mr." Vance, a man not easily intimidated, looked at Thorne over the top of his spectacles. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "has discovered a mineral claim of immense value. This property, which I believe you sold to him, is worth, well, incalculable, is the first word that comes to mind." Thorne's face went slack, his jaw dropping, the color drained from his cheeks. He stared at Silas, then at the rock, then back at Silas. He saw not a fool, but a man who had seen something he had entirely missed. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in his life, Jedediah Thorne was speechless. He turned without another word and walked out. His shoulders slumped. He wasn't just humbled. He was defeated, not by a rival, but by his own arrogance. The news spread through the town like a grass fire. The man who had bought a pile of ash was now the wealthiest man in the valley. The chorus of laughter had turned into a chorus of stunned, reverent silence. The seasons turned, the snows melted, and the high country bloomed with the fierce, fragile beauty of a mountain spring. Outsiders began to arrive in Redemption Peak. Engineers from the east, investors with sober suits and fat wallets, all of them seeking an audience with Silas Croft. They came with offers, with contracts, with promises of great wealth. Silas met with them all, listened patiently, but he was in no hurry. He had learned the value of patience from the land itself. He sold a small, limited partnership to a scrupulous mining company from Denver, retaining majority ownership and full control of the land. He insisted on methods that would least harm the valley, stipulating that a portion of the profits go toward building a proper school and a clinic for the town. He was not a king hoarding treasure. He was a steward tending a garden. He did not rebuild the burned-out cabin. He left the stone chimney standing, a monument to Alistair MacLeod, and cleared the foundation, planting a garden of hardy mountain wildflowers within its stone embrace. On a nearby rise, with a clear view of the valley below and the peaks above, he began to build a new house. It was not a mansion. It was a modest, solid home, built of pine and river stone, with a wide porch and large windows to let in the light. One evening, at the golden hour when the sun slants low and sets the world ablaze in shades of amber and rose, Silas stood on that rise. The frame of his new home stood behind him, smelling of freshly cut wood. Below, in the valley, the lights of Redemption Peak were beginning to flicker on, a small constellation of human hope. Bartholomew stood beside him, his old head resting on Silas's shoulder. Silas stroked the horse's graying muzzle, his gaze fixed on the distant flower-filled ruin of the old cabin. He had come here with nothing but grief and the memory of loss. He had found a fortune, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the tellurium was not the true treasure. It was just a means to an end. The real discovery was something else entirely. He looked out at the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving land that was now his home. that he would protect and nurture for the rest of his days. "It wasn't about what was in the ground, old friend," he murmured, his voice quiet in the vast stillness. "It was about having ground to stand on." He had found his place again, not by chasing what the world valued, but by tending to what it had discarded. Thank you for staying with us to the end of Silas Croft's incredible journey. It's a story about the value of patience and the wisdom of seeing what others overlook. If you were moved by his story, please leave a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next tale from the annals of history. We'll see you next time.